Hi, I'm Terry Sohl. I'm the acting branch chief of the Integrated Science and Applications branch at USGS Aeros in Sioux Falls. Today I'm going to talk about interdisciplinary land use modeling that we do at Aeros and the role of SyncroSim and some of the other USGS modeling that's already incorporated within SyncroSim environment. USGS Aeros, we're the home of Landsat. We have a very long history of land change monitoring using Landsat and other data, and that includes three landmark national scale products for the U.S. The first is the National Land Cover Database, and so this is a product that goes back to 1992. It was really the first national scale 30-meter product that was available, and continues to have a very heavy user base to the current day. We also have Landfire, which was developed starting in about 2001, which was specifically developed to feed into the fire community. So both from a pre-fire perspective and a post-fire perspective, helping to manage fire and the repercussions of fire. And then we have LCMAP, the new kid on the block. So LCMAP is a unique effort to use a new approach touching on every cloud-free pixel in the Landsat archive to build a harmonic model that basically looks at phenology over time and fits a model to it and is able to identify breakpoints where change on the landscape has occurred. The nice thing about each one of these projects is while they all share Landsat as their source data, while they're all 30-meter pixel based, they each have thematic differences, temporal differences, and then differences in the type of complementary products that are provided. And the power of all three of these products is that in combination, they tell a really unprecedented story on what's happening on the landscape in the U.S. However, they are limited to the availability of remote sensing data, of Landsat data. And so what we're trying to do with the modeling work that we do at USGS Aeros is temporarily extend those data both backward and forward in time when remote sensing data aren't available. And that includes both historical and future projections. And so if we think about impacts of something like climate, can we take land use data, model it backwards in time for a long enough period that we can look at those long-term climate impacts, not only on the landscape, but on related processes such as hydrology, biodiversity, or carbon and greenhouse gases. And then can we take that same methodology, those same data, model forward in time, and look at the future impacts on those same processes, and hopefully to help us mitigate and plan for the negative impacts of those potential changes. When we started to design this framework 15 or so years ago, we knew that we had certain characteristics in mind, and one was first and foremost consistency. LCMAP, NLCD, Landfire, each one of these has a very wide user base. And in order for these modeled land cover data to fit into existing workflows, we knew that we wanted data that was consistent both spatially and thematically. So you could take a modeled land cover product and plug it in seamlessly to another workflow that's already using LCMAP and NLCD. We knew we wanted complete coverage, so providing lands coverage for all lands of the United States. We wanted to know a long-term time series, so again, that long-term historical reconstruction and future projections, something that allows us to look at something that is long-term, such as climate change impacts. It had to be an approach that's flexible and extensible. The geography of the U.S. is very broad and very variable and distinct, and so we needed an approach that worked regardless of geography, regardless of extent that we're looking at. And it's also interdisciplinary, so something that accounts for all the broad array of impacts on land use and land cover. And if we think of the things that impact land use and land cover, it's a number of biophysical parameters, including climate change, but a lot of socioeconomic variables as well. So we started to develop the 4C model about 15 years ago, and that's primarily what I want to talk about. Within ApexRMS, you are already probably familiar with the Lucas model, and so this is a model that Ben Sleater, one of our colleagues in USGS, has worked on, a state and transition model that looks at land use, that looks at carbon, that's already has a long history of integration within SyncroSim. What we're trying to do right now is take the 4C model and do something similar. And 4C is a demand and spatial allocation model, and that means that we have a demand module that provides quantitative aggregate proportions of change for an entire study area. So that could be a river basin, an ecoregion, or a state. And we have a spatial allocation module that allocates change on the landscape until we meet that demand. In 23 and 2024, what we're working on is we have new funding that's supporting ApexRMS to integrate 4C capabilities within SyncroSim. And that's what I want to talk about, is this model, the capabilities that we're bringing into SyncroSim, and how that complements and feeds into the type of modeling that Lucas does. One of the advantages of the model that we use is that it's very heavily parameterized by that breadth of land change data that we get from Landsat and other remote sensing data. And there's a number of different variables that are very reliant in the model on these historical data, and that includes basic information on rates of change, so trying to identify transition probabilities, or identifying scenarios, or looking at forest disturbance and the like. These are all characteristics of historical land change that we can parameterize directly from remote sensing data and incorporate in the 4C model. Patch characteristics. So we do know that there are certain patch sizes and patch shapes and distributions for different land cover types. And depending on the version of 4C, we can parameterize the model based on those patch sizes to replicate realistic patch size differences over time as we model into the future. The spatial distribution. Some land cover types tend to occur in a clumped fashion, and urbanization is one example. While other land cover types, for example, maybe forest disturbance and cutting, could be more spatially dispersed. We can quantify that from remote sensing data and use that in the model to parameterize it. And then finally, we can generate parcels themselves from remote sensing data. And so our model 4C is a parcel-based model. It's not a pixel-based model. So we're changing land on the landscape parcel by parcel using real land ownership and land management boundaries where available. Sometimes those boundaries aren't available, and so what we can do is use this historical data and convolutional neural nets to help develop pseudo-parcels that are suitable for our modeling. One of the key parts of 4C are suitability surfaces, and these suitability surfaces really drive where change occurs on the landscape. And so for every land cover type that we model, we develop a probability surface, a suitability surface, that defines a likelihood that that pixel can support that given land use type. 4C, as a modeling capability, can have these suitability surfaces change over time as we have projected changes in climate, in water use, or water availability. And so, for example, what you see on the right is a suitability surface for corn in this particular area, the Delaware River Basin. That suitability surface is modified as the model iterates forward in time. As we input new climate data, the suitability for corn may shift. As we input new data on water use and water availability, the suitability might shift for corn. And so it's a model where the where part is very sensitive to some of those driving forces that dictate the likelihood that a pixel can support that given land use. So this is an example of the type of product we produce. This is a graphic, if you've ever seen me present, you've probably seen, but this is down in Lubbock, Texas. First of all the black lines that you see are real land ownership and land management parcels. What we try to do, again, is replicate the data sets that our users are using, whether that's NLCD or LCMAP, or in this case, the cropland data layer from the U.S. Department of Ag, which has basically NLCD classes, but also thematic cropland classes. We're using parcel-based modeling, and so you don't see pixel by pixel change for the anthropogenic change. You see every parcel acting as a single unit. We also have a model that responds to changes in climate and water availability. So from an anthropogenic land use perspective, one of the things you see on here is purple. That's irrigated cotton. Over time, the climate's getting hotter, the climate's getting drier. As it gets hotter and drier, and as the supporting aquifer that provides groundwater to irrigate these lands is diminishing, all of that irrigated cotton goes away. And it tends to go towards either rangeland classes of grassland and shrub, or it goes to a dry land class like wheat. The other thing you note about this particular graphic are some of the natural vegetation changes. And so if you look at the tan color, at the start of the simulation, tan is a natural grassland color. There's a sage, kind of a greenish color, that represents shrubland. Over time, as it gets hotter and drier, the climate is preferentially trending towards something that's better for shrubland than grassland in this area. And as a result, you see that shift over time of grassland to shrubland. This is another example of those same shifts. This is on the Colorado-Kansas border. So this is 2014, the start of the simulation for this particular modeling exercise. We can run one scenario in RCP 4.5, and under that climate, again, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, and under that hotter and drier climate, we get a preferential move towards shrubland away from grassland. We go to a little bit higher climate change scenario, we get more shrubland. RCP 8.5, an even higher level of change in climate, and we get a more extensive change from grassland to shrub. So once again, the model is very sensitive to climate as it iterates forward in time. We're looking at modeling not only future conditions, but historical conditions. And so for an ecoregion like, or a river basin like the Delaware River Basin, we've modeled all the way back to pre-settlement, so before European settlement had a big impact on the landscape, and all the way up to 2100. And so we end up with almost over a 400-year record of landscape change that goes back to pre-existing conditions when European settlement hadn't touched the landscape, when most of the landscape was a forested class in this area, all the way through the current days when we see agriculture pop up at the appropriate time. We see Reading, Pennsylvania, the town and the center, grow over time. We see reservoirs pop up at the appropriate time based on historical reservoir database that we have. And then we model out into the future. And so we have this 400-year record where, again, we can look at the impacts of climate change, hydrology, biodiversity over a very long term and help to mitigate and plan for how those changes might happen in the future. The model also tracks forest cutting underneath and can use protected area databases and GIS frameworks to help dictate where change can occur in the landscape. This is Crater Lake out in Oregon, and this demonstrates how forest age is impacted by the model's capability to protect lands from change, and that you have forest age in the middle at the start of the simulation, forest age by the end of the simulation on the right, and you can see the impacts of being able to protect forest and forest cutting over time in an area like a national park or a wilderness area. The model is also very heavily tied into water use and water availability, and for an example, we've been working with Gabriel Siné to tie evapotranspiration modeling to the land use work that we've done. And so in this case, he's using land use to look at evapotranspiration out into the future. We in turn can use that evapotranspiration information into our model. So we can look at ET, we can look at what are the water needs for a given crop, for example. We can look at precipitation and climate for that future date. We can look at future water availability from a ground and surface water perspective for that future date. And that all drives suitability. So water use, water availability, climate, and land use, closing the loop among all of those and trying to identify what the land is best able to support. Current research right now is focused on several different areas, continuing to develop the model, continuing to bring that model capability within SyncroSim, but also trying to plug some holes that make our modeling difficult. One of those is parcel data. And so parcel data themselves, in terms of getting real land ownership and land management parcels, is difficult. And so one of the things we're doing right now is using those long landscape histories to identify parcels of land that have behaved similarly over time and develop pseudo-parcels that can be used to fill in the gaps of where existing real parcels are not available. We're currently looking at convolutional neural nets too for a totally new approach from the land change modeling perspective. So instead of a demand allocation module approach that also uses parcels, we're looking at CNNs to do the whole shebang. And so basically to take historical data from the entire Landsat-based remote sensing archive, use that as input to a convolutional neural net, and using that to drive the quantity of change, the spatial allocation of change, and also it eliminates that need for parcels. So this is really a new ground-setting capability that we're trying to develop with the 4C model that helps us to eliminate some of those needs that we had with the older modeling approach, and helps us develop a new, hopefully cutting-edge approach to modeling land cover change. So where are we with 4C and SyncroSim? And one thing I will say about 4C is that 4C has always been a model that's been internal to USGS. It's something that we've never had the resources to port to open source or to support use by the public. So one of the huge advantages of what we're trying to do with 4C is that bringing in a SyncroSim will be the first time that these capabilities are available to the public. But ultimately, what we want to do is also capitalize on the breadth of what the SyncroSim environment provides from other modeling perspective, model linkage, data management. Our initial focus is a straight port of the 4C model into SyncroSim. So that's something that's ongoing right now. So taking the 4C model as a whole unit, trying to incorporate those into SyncroSim, seeing how we can potentially do that within the SyncroSim environment. But then evaluating the characteristics of the model and how it fits within SyncroSim, and how we can best tailor the model itself within that environment. But ultimately, what we want to do is develop a more modular modeling approach that takes the capabilities of both 4C and Lucas. So, working with Ben Sleater, the two models really are very complementary in that they each have a different approach, which I'll get to in a second, but they each have different strengths of what they model on the landscape, with 4C being very adept at modeling anthropogenic change using parcel-based networks to get really high-resolution spatial representation of what's happening on the landscape. Versus something like Lucas that does a really nice job with state and transition models on natural vegetation change. It has fire modeling that we don't do. You put them all together, and these two models really have a lot to complement each other. And so what we're trying to do after we get the 4C capability within SyncroSim is to identify the strengths of each and develop modules that allow a land change modeler to capitalize on each one of those individual elements from the individual models into one coherent, harmonized modeling environment. And not only does that improve our model of the capability of the model itself, it helps us to evaluate model uncertainties. Both of these models, from a state and transition model side on Lucas to a demand and spatial allocation model on 4C, they're very different approaches. And so even modeling the same area with the same thematic land cover classes and the same scenario, it's a very interesting exercise to look at how the two models develop the actual model output. And that's something that helps us to develop uncertainties in the model, not related to scenarios and the like, but related to the model itself. And so this is where we're going.